Welcome to Building Reddit. I'm your host, Ryan H. Lewis. Reddit's infrastructure hasn't always been as reliable as it is today, and principal software engineer Jason Harvey is one of the main people responsible for the progress and improvements that took the site from 8 hours of downtime a week to the current 99% uptime. He started at the company in 2011 and has been in the middle of most of the changes to the Reddit infrastructure since then. Jason had a lot to share about how those improvements were implemented, what he does at his job every day, and how Alaskans like to meme. Here's our conversation. All right. Well, hi, Jason. Thanks for joining the podcast. To start with, what do you do at Reddit and when did you start?
Hi, Ryan. I am a principal engineer and I started originally in January of 2011. So I've been here, I was away for 2 years, so I've been here for 10 of the past 12 years.
Okay, so as a principal software engineer, what are you responsible for now?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Each of the principal engineers at Reddit, we tend to fill different types of roles. Like all of us are pretty unique in terms of the areas we focus on. I'm much more of a systems focused person. So I tend to, I look at our overall systems. I see how things are performing. I consider how can we take our current infrastructure and move it into the future. I also am responsible for doing some advanced troubleshooting. There's some cases where, hey, there's this systemic failure that's involving these multiple different pieces that are strung across multiple different areas of our infrastructure. And sometimes it gets to like some very specific nitty-gritty details that not a lot of people have the time or maybe the knowledge in order to troubleshoot. And so sometimes I will dive into there and solve those things. And then another big part of my role is directing the future of what we want the infrastructure to look like at Reddit. There's a lot of things that we need to get done and a lot of new directions that we need to take on a lot of the infrastructure. And I'm there to help inform on that. I'm not doing all the work. I'm not writing all the docs or anything like that, but I am spend a lot of my time thinking about and trying to add information to the conversation on where we want to go and how we're going to get there.
How do you do that? It seems like every day there's some new technology that comes out. And so how do you decide, or how do you pick ones that would be worth the company investing in?
Yeah, for sure. So at Reddit, we have a kind of a design doc process. So if someone sees that there's a problem, first of all, that's you must have a problem that's identified that they want to go about solving. So you write up a design doc, maybe you start with one pager that basically describes, hey, here's a problem I would like to solve, and here is kind of how I would like to solve it. And then you go into some detail about, okay, here are the details of the problem. Here's how I believe the solution will work. Here are the potential alternatives that exist. And in general, there's all kinds of flashy tech that's coming out all the time. I'm much more interested in the very fundamentals of the problem and then trying to find, okay, which possible technology might solve for this instead of going for the technology first. That's at least that's the approach that I tend to prefer. I know that there are people that will see something like, oh my gosh, this would be really cool, and maybe we'll open up new ideas on how we could go about solving for some things. And so sometimes you will occasionally see a design doc that's there's only one thing out there, and this is a very interesting solution. Let's just go ahead and try it. And that's reasonable as well. But in general, I really do like to see it from a problem first perspective and then trying to figure out what technology will fit in to solve for that problem.
I would imagine that focusing on the problem first can help you avoid places of premature optimization or things where you're imagining a problem that doesn't exist yet and trying to solve for that.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing, if you don't have the problem in mind, then it becomes unclear what you're actually solving for. And so people won't have an agreement on will this thing be capable of doing this? Well, do you need it to do that? And if you do need it to do, in what way? What are the requirements of that type of thing? What's the failure modes that thing can withstand? If you don't have those sorts of details, then it's really hard to say oh, I believe that this solution will work. Because okay, but where are you actually going to use it? What is it going to solve for?
Okay, so you've been at Reddit. You've been working on Reddit things for 10 years. What are some of the things that you've been involved in that people may be aware of, I guess, externally?
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. In the earlier days, when I originally joined Reddit, we had no SSL for the site. So moving the site to SSL was a pretty big earlier initiative that I worked on. I was really happy to actually see finalized. I mean, it's impossible to think about now because everything uses like SLR TLS for security for every website. It's the bare minimum expectation. But in 2011, it wasn't quite as common. And it was not a thing on Reddit for a lot of our APIs. You could log in and that would use TLS, but from there on, a lot of the interactions were not using TLS. So that was a very unexpectedly large lift for various parts of the infrastructure, and I was very happy when it was finally finished. I think that was completed in 2013 or 2014 or so, if memory serves. Some other things I've worked on. So on the interface side of things, there's you can go to a subreddit and it'll say like the number of subscribers. And when I saw that number bothered me for a long time because it didn't give like an idea of the scope of activity that was happening in that subreddit. So I added a feature in there called users here now. So you could get an idea of for each individual subreddit, how many users are actively looking at that subreddit or participating in that subreddit, have voted on something in that subreddit recently or made a comment there to give you a sense of like, okay, how many people are actually looking at this thing right now, which was a fun feature to write. It's one of the few times I've dove into the front end code of the site that tends to not be my foray. I'm more of a back end person, but it was fun to get in there a little bit. Something more recently. So we've been in a services-based architecture for a while. We've been on Kubernetes for a while. I think we started our Kubernetes journey in 2017 or 2018 or so, but there was this really big piece of the infrastructure that was not in Kubernetes and was our monolith, which is kind of still a lot of the center of a lot of the interactions on the site. And that was not in Kubernetes. And there was a lot of hesitancy around trying to get it into Kubernetes because it's a legacy monolith and it's not shaped in such a way that makes sense with some common Kubernetes concepts. But it was that really big exception to everything else being in Kubernetes. So I was tasked with moving it into Kubernetes and was able to do so. It was an interesting process and kind of hit a lot of unusual hiccups with that, but I got it done.
Teams that I've been on that I've had much shorter time span, a lot of times if there's something that I was heavily involved in, I'll be at least like a reviewer of enhancements to that feature in the future. For pretty much all of these things, do you like keep in touch with them, or do you still keep an eye on like if somebody changes something with the users here now, do you get pinged or do you care?
So not on that specific feature. It did get rewritten a few years after I wrote it, redesigned slightly, but as a function of the amount of time I've been here, I tend to be a subject matter expert on a lot of different pieces of the infrastructure. And so I bring a lot of context to the conversation on many different pieces. That monolith, that was the only system that existed when I was originally here. And so I have pretty strong authoritative knowledge, not only on how it functions, but also on the journey that is taken over those years. When an engineer looks at an API and they ask, why the heck is this like this? Usually there is a story behind why the heck it is like that. And I'm there to provide that story for those people.
So I'm curious, what does your day look like? I'm a staff engineer. My day is going to look different than a principal engineer. So what does like a normal day look like for you in terms of what you're working on, who you're talking to, what your calendar looks like, stuff like that?
Yeah. So on the practical side of things, so I work remotely along with most of my peers at Reddit, and I think most of the engineering staff is remote nowadays, if I'm correct. I also work from Alaska, so I tend to wake up a little bit later than everyone else, which is an interesting experience, just in terms of practical meeting arrangement and things like that. But yeah, I usually will start my morning, first of all, just like checking on pings, because I tend to get usually a handful of pings over the night, maybe from like the East Coast folks or folks over in Europe, just asking individual questions, things like that. Just basically clearing my inbox for interactive stuff that has happened while I was asleep. I hop in, check on any systems health issues that might have been popping up, check my review queue for things I'm going to review for that day, do some team meetings, have some syncs with various folks, and just kind of getting ready for the day in general, trying to keep an eye on things that might interrupt me later in that day. And I think usually I'll have a handful of interviews on any given week, so those tend to be earlier in the day just because of my time zone. So we'll frequently be doing interviews as well. But it tends to be a lot of organization, getting prepared for the day, talking with people, answering questions, that type of thing, clearing my inbox.
How much, maybe not even just coding, but like hands-on software touching or infra touching work do you normally do in maybe a week? Because I know some days are just probably meetings and catching up.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, I'm probably higher in terms of proportion than most of the other principal engineers. I would say maybe in some ways I don't do a whole lot of coding itself, but I am probably digging into systems stuff maybe 30% of my time in a given week. Maybe 30 to 40%, which I think is pretty high for an engineer at my progression in my career, and I really value that. I like getting my hands dirty. I have always felt more like a mechanic than an engineer. I like diving in there and seeing how I can help. And there's definitely there are principal engineers that will spend very little of their time getting their hands dirty, and I don't begrudge them all. I think they're providing a good amount of value when they're doing so. And I think there is an argument like that, as you go up in your career ladder, that you want to spend time on bigger problems and spend less time on getting your hands dirty. But I really appreciate it, and I like it for honing my skills. And I really like a depth-based approach to learning some very specific tech, because it does help me, and I can use that to, in turn, help others. So being able to troubleshoot very difficult problems, for example, like stuff that's getting into kernel type performance. There's not a lot of other engineers at the company that have the time or the skills in order to do so. That's something that I tend to spend a lot of time in. So I get quite a bit of depth in that area. And I can use that to leverage myself to solve some problems and hopefully free up time for a lot of other people in the company. So in general, what my role should be is to use the skills that I can to make things easier for other engineers. And that can be via, helping someone get through a contentious design doc, or it can be solving an extremely annoying problem that has been plaguing people for months and months and months and eating up a bunch of time that people just haven't been able to crack yet.
How did things usually get to you? Like, so if someone, like you just mentioned, somebody's just like, maybe if they have a design doc question, they can ping you in a design doc. But if somebody's working on something, like, is it typical that people just know at a certain point, like, hey, call Jason? Or do you have a queue that, like, where tickets get to you somehow?
So there is definitely a call Jason scenario that exists. That was a setup that was kind of overused, not like due to anyone's fault. It's just when you become a subject matter expert in something, and that something is a core piece of a largest infrastructure for a largest organization, you end up getting pinged a lot. So in previous series, I have been in situations where it's like, oh my gosh, the number of pings that are coming in are way too high. The number of things I'm getting tagged in are way too high. This needs to calm down, and we need to get to a situation where I need to be involved less. So it is a potentially problematic symptom if I'm getting pinged too many times. But in terms of someone actually reaching out to me, yeah, it'll be a situation of like, oh my gosh, this problem is really gnarly. We don't know how to solve it. It's either in this very old legacy system, or it is dealing with this very nitty-gritty technical detail that not a lot of people at the company know how to solve. They can reach out to me. They can reach out to my manager and see if I have time available for going about tackling that sort of thing. Or I might just happen to notice it. I end up following a lot of the various channels that we have at the company, and it is probably too easy to nerd stat me into an interesting problem when something interesting pops up that's like, oh my gosh, why is this happening like this? And then I also like, one of the things I have on my monitors here is kind of a screen which displays like overall systems health, and I'm kind of always have that in the corner of my eye. So whenever there's like any individual little glitch, I'm always like, wonder what's going on there. Is that something interesting that's going on? Is somebody looking at that? And I can reach out to those like individual teams and say, hey, have you all seen this? And sometimes they will say, oh, yep, we'll get right on that. And other times it'll be, oh my gosh, that is weird. Can you help us solve this?
Nice. So the lesson to take away is that Jason is always watching. He's got the dashboards up to.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have alerts for a lot of our systems, and those are pretty good alerts. But the alerts, if they're set too sensitively, they will go off all the time, and it will wake up people at unreasonable hours of the night, which is not cool. But I, as a human, can look at these things and say that, hey, this is actually really bad and it's happened really suddenly. Even if like the alert's going to take 60 more seconds to fire, I can like get us started 60 seconds earlier, which is sometimes worth it. So I really like the human aspect of being able to look at something and say that, oh my gosh, that's really bad is a good property. I suspect over time as observability improves and as you probably even start to involve things eventually like AI analysis of these things, then I will have to do that less often and we'll probably be able to detect those things more easily of like, oh my gosh, we need to fire a page on this immediately. Rather than wait 60 seconds. So I suspect that role will go down. But for now, I actually feel that gap sometime.
Okay, let's talk about your history at Reddit. You said you started in 2011.
Yep.
What was the interview process like back then?
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. So I actually just saw on the blog that they were looking to hire. And I was a user of the site and I wasn't really looking for another job at the time. I was pretty happy in my role. But I was like, hey, I really like this site. I like spending time on it. And I also think it's really cool that this very interesting site is being ran by a very small number of people. At the time there were 4 engineers at the company total, which is pretty small. This was around, I think, October, November of 2010 is when I saw the blog post. So the blog post that was asking for candidates, they had like a little puzzle in there on how to reach out to them to actually get in the candidacy process, which I guess was just kind of a filter such that they didn't probably get a lot of spam because if you are a team of 4 engineers, you can only review so many resumes and you don't want a bunch of spam filling that up. I think the question that they had in there was like, if you had like an Olympic sized swimming pool and you filled that with a gold, what would be the mass of that gold? And then that gave an answer that you multiply by some of the factor, and then I got an email address that I was able to reach out to. So I reached out. They said, okay, cool. Here is a take-home project, and you get picked from one of 3 things. The first one was just getting Reddit running. So at the time, Reddit was open source, and the source was out there, but it was not in a structure that was easy to get it running. So getting it running was actually kind of like a reasonable challenge and a lift in order to actually do that. That was the first possible task. The second possible task I can't remember, but the third one was to like implement an auto-scaling infrastructure of some web page, right? And I really wanted the job, so I went way overboard. And I did the combination of the first and the third thing. I got Reddit running and I got it in an auto-scaling system, which, when you look at that today, that's like, oh my gosh, that's easy peasy. How hard could that possibly be? Everything is auto-scaling because everything like has that expectation. But at the time, the infrastructure wasn't always there. The tooling wasn't always there. And also the Reddit app itself didn't have the expectation of this actually going on. So it was a fun challenge. I put way too much time in it considering I was just in an early candidacy process. I think I put 30 or 40 hours in, but it worked perfectly when I was done. I submitted it in, and like a couple days later, I got an email back saying, "Oh, sorry, we didn't hear from you." And I was like, "Oh my God, no! I put so much time into this. Please, please, please." I reached back out again. My email just went to their spam filter.
Oh no!
For whatever reason, and so it didn't get mapped up. But they saw my submission. Like I was able to get that earned out, and they wanted to chat with me. They were interested in doing an interview.
Cool. Was it? I mean, I feel like tech interviews these days have they have like kind of like a stable format places. Was it similar back then? Did you do whiteboarding?
Yeah, there was a bit of whiteboarding. So I flew out to San Francisco. I was living in Texas at the time. I flew out to San Francisco. We did a bit of whiteboarding. We did a bit of systems chatter. It was just kind of like a good amount of meeting the team. Like I said, it was 4 people at that time. At least on the engineering side, it was a tiny little corner office of the Wired magazine. Walked back there and just into that little office, postcards covering the wall from Reddit users that had sent them in, and just these 4 people trying to keep things running, and it felt like a pretty cool atmosphere. There were some whiteboarding exercises where we went about describing some architecture. There was actually a kind of a fun interviewing question, which is a bit quiz-like. We don't use it anymore, so I'm happy to share it here. you would write out the alphabet, and then for each letter in the alphabet, you would list like a common Unix tool that started with that letter. The hardest one was O. Ryan, do you have an idea what a Linux tool starting with O is?
No, I don't know enough commands.
There's only two. There's actually really two common ones.
Okay.
One is OpenSSL for OpenSSL stuff, and the other is OD for octal dump.
Got it.
I didn't get O, I don't think, or maybe I put OpenSSL. I can't recall. But yeah, that was one of the reading questions we used at the time. We've moved away from that type of quiz-based question, but we still use a very similar architecture-based exercise that I performed, and I still give that interview today. In that interview, you basically present a prompt to the candidate, and you say, "Hey, here's something we want to build. Let's build an architecture to go about solving for it." It starts simple, and then we add more load to it. Things start breaking down. How do we go about changing that system? So it's a kind of a realistic scenario. It's a pretty fun question, and it gives an idea of like some of the actual things that you end up working on in this sort of role. And at the time I was applying, it was just a systems administration role. I can't even remember the title it was. I don't think there was a title really attached with it.
That's fun. Employee of Reddit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I remember like earlier on after I had joined, there was some reason where I needed to put a title, and I was like, oh yeah, what do I put here? And they're like, I don't know. What do you want to put there? Like, I guess sysadmin. I'm not really sure. What would you say I do here?
Could have put king. You could have put ruler.
Yeah, I think one of the other employees of the company put like internet cowboy or something like that.
There you
go. Systems cowboy, something along those lines.
Nice. Okay. So you mentioned why you were interested in applying, because you used the site and you thought it was interesting with team size. Once you actually went through the interview process, and I'm assuming they made you an offer, why did you then decide to leave your job that you were very comfortable in and then actually join Reddit?
Yeah, I mean, as mentioned, I was really impressed that, hey, there's this tiny little team doing this really cool thing with this very interesting site, and there's a lot of opportunity for me to dive into here. And it was not even a startup at the time. Nowadays you might think of that scenario. It's like, hey, there's a startup and there's 4 people and it's on the site that has this really significant impact and it's getting all this traffic. Why wouldn't you join that? That's like on a crazy upward trajectory. But Reddit wasn't a startup. It was a division within Condé Nast, which is a publishing company. And so it was a very kind of different dynamic than you might see when you're moving to a company in the Bay Area for a tech role. So I didn't really know much at the time, I guess. I mean, I don't know if I would say that there were red flags, but there were definitely warning signs that if I was further along in my career, I'd been like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Why is that structured like that? That might have shied me away. But I mean, I had stars in my eyes and I was just really impressed. I was like, this is a very cool thing. I can work with this small number of people on this very interesting problem set. The site obviously has a lot of problems that I have expertise on, and I can help them go about solving it. And like, I can really hone my systems skills here. That's really like most of my career trajectory has been about honing my systems skills, getting better at the tools that I use, getting more familiar with those tools, learning new tools. That is kind of what really drives me. And I thought this was an incredible opportunity to go about doing that.
Yeah, I'll bet you got to learn a lot of new tools.
Yes, a lot
in the course of that. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about what Reddit looked like, the infrastructure when you joined, and I guess even some of the software too. But what was it? What was it like? What was shocking?
Sure. I mean, so it was already in Amazon by the time I had joined. If I recall correctly, they moved the infrastructure in Amazon into EC2 around 2009. So I joined in January 2011. We were already in Amazon. But the infrastructure, the folks who were working on it were largely software devs, and they didn't have a lot of experience with managing systems. And so a lot of the common systems stuff that you would expect to see just wasn't there. One example is everyone logged into every box with the same account. There was one Unix account to rule them all, and everyone shared the same home directory. And I got in and I was disgusted. It was like, we're going to change this. And it was kind of funny because they're like, are you sure we really need to change this? It's kind of convenient for everyone to share the same home directory. And it's like, no, you will be okay. We're changing this. And so that was one of the first things that I did. I put some configuration management in place. There was no config management in the company at the time. So like launching a server was involved going about provisioning an EC2 instance, logging into that box, and then typing a bunch to do a bunch of configuration to try to make it look like every other box, which is insane. So I got Puppet in place at the time, which was the configuration engine of my choice, basically. And everyone else was like, sure, yeah, whatever you want. So I tossed that in. We actually had some standard configuration. I broke up the home directory, so not everyone was sharing one account with one user, and people had their own home directories to do things in. Yeah, it was interesting. So we were running EC2. Postgres was running an EC2 as well. Memcache was running an EC2, and then Cassandra was also in place. And Cassandra was kind of fascinating because it was like version 0.8 when I had joined. Like that's an early version of Cassandra, and it had quite a few rough edges at the time. And so I ended up dumping a lot of time into the storage side of things. That I would say my first year was generally focused on storage and trying to make the storage story sane. And because I think a lot of the downtime that we were experiencing, I mean, at the time, the infrastructure was regularly going down for like 8 hours a week. Just because of weaknesses all over the place. And the storage was a big key of that. So trying to tame the Cassandra rings, or Cassandra ring, I should say, there was just one, and then keep Postgres running, I think was the majority of my first year at Reddit.
Did you find that like when you came in, were the existing Reddit developers, were they like, oh, here's Jason, he knows everything about systems and like we're just going to let him do whatever he wants? Or like you gave the example of people logging into boxes and you're kind of like, this is wrong. Yeah. Was that like were those hard discussions to have, or was everybody just like very freewheeling, I don't know, San Francisco types?
It was kind of freewheeling. It varied, I would say, on different areas. There were definitely times where we had quite a bit of discussion on areas, but I wouldn't say anything was ever really contentious. Because everything was on fire all the time. And when things are on fire all the time, the people fighting the fires don't tend to argue with one another, right? You just try to go about getting things done and putting the fire out in any way you can. So while there was some discussion, there was some people that maybe not necessarily were convinced of certain things. People didn't really try to get in anyone else's way. You just tried to make sure that we were kind of going in the direction towards stability. And as long as it seemed to make sense on paper, you just went off and did it. There were no design docs. There were like not even pull requests in a lot of cases. Like pull requests was kind of, that was a little bit of a new concept, that I was not pushing. There was another engineer at the company, Neil Williams, who was our only developer for a short period of time, that wanted to really instill the concepts of pull requests and getting review and things like that of the company, which was a little bit new for some folks that not everyone was comfortable doing because they would feel like it would slow them down. And nowadays it's like, oh, obviously, why would you not do that thing? It's fascinating to think about like if any of those type of practices existed anywhere in the company today, how they would be like considered absolutely ridiculous. Like not having pull requests for deploying or like rolling out a system without a design doc. It's such a different reality today. I mean, even if you were starting, like if you were a newer startup today, the infrastructure, like there's so much stuff that just becomes a given. Things like auto scaling, things like some configuration management, like at a minimum, that I don't think you would see another scenario quite like I walked into in Reddit in 2011.
Yeah. I feel like there's some deep part of me that anytime I ever like push to like the main branch, I feel like uncomfortable, even if it's like a personal repo. I'm just like, something doesn't feel right. So, yeah.
Well, at that time, if we pushed into the main branch, you had to go about like doing a manual deploy across all the boxes because there was no CI/CD to speak of. I don't think CI/CD was very much of a term at that time. At least not one that we were using, definitely.
So you mentioned everything was on fire.
Yeah.
I've read that Reddit was down a lot in the past.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm curious, tell me what it was like, and then tell me some of the most important things that you either were able to implement or were able to oversee implementing that helped that downtime.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, one of the problems we had is we just didn't have a lot of good observability on how much was going down. We did have some basic graphing and things like that, but there wasn't even really a lot of alerting. I mean, I remember walking into the office one morning and one of the engineers, Jeremy Edberg, was on a call with some reporters who thought that, has Reddit gone away? Because we had been down for several hours that day, and no one noticed because we didn't really have a whole lot of alerting in place, and people were sleeping when it was down. All the employees were sleeping, and so I was like, "What? Like, how did we not have an idea that the site went down?" And so that day, I hacked in a very, very simple ping me script if the site is not able to come up or site is not reachable, and it reached out to us via Jabber on Google Hangouts before it was GChat, just to get some basic observability and monitoring so that we could know that the site was down so we could respond to it. So that was a gap that had to be covered. I would say the state, the stateful storage of the system was overall the source of a lot of the downtime. And that got slowly better. There was a lot of struggle. Like I said, Cassandra was very early. There were a lot of bugs and performance oddities with it just because it was a pre 1.0 version. And every upgrade, it tended to introduce some problems as well. So I would have this expectations 0.8 to 1.0. This is going to be a panacea. Everything's going to be perfect now, right? No, 1.0 had plenty of problems as well, and 1.2 had plenty of problems. And then just executing the upgrade took, we would hit weird and interesting and fascinating bugs on that side of things. So Cassandra was the source of quite a bit of contention. On the Postgres side, Postgres itself was pretty reliable. We were using replication via statement-based replication via SkyTools was the system at the time that basically uses triggers to watch for changes and then replicates those changes across the other databases. Gosh, we had this ridiculous problem that had plagued us for years. I think it was finally figured out in 2012, where whenever we would have contention in the primary database, replication would break. And that is very bad, and we would have to take the site down intentionally in order to fix it. And this was a cause of so many ridiculous hours of downtime. And there was this system in the application that actually tried to observe the Postgres databases and see, hey, it's which of the replicas is least loaded? I'll send my queries there. That it's kind of interesting. You don't really see a lot of applications themselves trying to monitor the systems level metrics of the databases in order to make those sorts of decisions. That's not a concept you have today, but that's what existed here. And I ripped out some of that, and some of the engineers helped me tear out some of that so that it was just kind of sending to all of them equally, and then I was balancing using other means on the Postgres servers. But we had this problem that when the primary database would come under contention, replication would break. I'd have to restore it, and we couldn't really figure this out. I was like, why is this happening? Is there a bug in SkyTools? Is there a bug somewhere in Postgres? It's almost never a bug in Postgres for anyone dealing with that. Postgres, I've seen have an extremely small number of bugs, and it just kept on plaguing us for so much time. And then eventually, I can't recall who found it. It wasn't me. There is in that code that monitored for the database activity. There was a situation where if the primary became under contention and couldn't reach out to it and there was no connection, it would start sending writes to the replicas. And if you send writes to the replicas, replication is now necessarily broken because there has been no failover. The primary came back up and then tried to replicate things over, and then those things already existed on the replicas. And it's just, I think it might have been an off by one type error. It's just oh my gosh, these 3 lines, how much downtime have these 3 lines in this application caused over the past 18 months? So solving that really, really helped with the Postgres availability, because we no longer had the broken replication scenario. And if I had been more versatile of an engineer at the time, and if I had more time, I would have done something earlier on where it's on the replicas we set the roles there such that you cannot write to them. That would have been the obvious thing to do, and it was on my essentially bucket list of stuff that needed to get done. But like I said, fires were going off all the time. We were we didn't always have good engineering practices when you're doing nothing but responding to fires. You're basically trying to like use duct tape to make sure, try to prevent a ship from sinking, right? And so good engineering does not result when you are using a ton of duct tape and you have a very small number of people in the company. But yeah, once that was solved, Postgres got much more stable. Another area that we saw a lot of issues on, and this was happening more in 2013, 2014, was Memcache. Like we ended up with this pretty sizable Memcache fleet. And if any one of the Memcache boxes went down or had a blip, the entire site was down because we used a sharding mechanism such that the main application would shard its keys and communicate with all the Memcache servers. But when you're rendering like the front page of Reddit, you probably have to fetch down hundreds of thousands of keys. And so if one or two of those keys are unavailable, then you can't render the page and it doesn't fail gracefully. That got quite a bit better once we moved to a piece of software called McRouter, which is actually a Facebook project that they open sourced. We were one of the pretty early users of once it open sourced. McRouter is basically a proxy that does the sharding for you and has concepts for things like failover and like observability of the individual memcaches and a gutter pool, such that if there is a memcache instance that's unavailable, instead of like timing out or like sending a hard error, it just sends those requests to a like an alternate memcache server, and so that really helped with the memcache downtime once that was moved to. I mean, there's more things, but we could spend hours talking about the interesting ways that Reddit was failing all the time, and the ways we went about solving it.
Does it feel different at Reddit nowadays than, I mean, sometimes like when I talk to people about how my week felt, it felt like I was personally putting out fires all week. But like, I don't know that that's necessarily true for the company. Like, how about you? Does it feel like it's different now compared to when you started in terms of like how many fires you're having to put out?
Yeah, I think so. And the nature of the fires are also very, very different. And I mean, at least now when fires come up, we have like postmortem processes, right? To try and look back and consider, hey, what was the cause of this fire? How could we prevent it in the future? We were like years away from that at the time I was ready. Even if we wanted to implement that type of thing, you know, I mean, in 2014, we had like, I want to say in what might be called the DevOps team, we had like 10 or 11 or 12 people or so in there. And then maybe it was under 50 engineers still, at least on the core application side in 2014. So there's no time to fit in any type of postmortem. Now we actually have postmortems, so we look back on things. The fires are definitely different. They tend to be smaller. They tend to have like, okay, there's individual little pieces that are now broken, but we also have a lot of interesting cascading failures in this system. So you will have a fire here, and it will spread in, you know, novel and interesting ways across maybe a dozen different services that impact like a bunch of different teams. And so you will have to like pull in a bunch of cross-functional folks to like, hey, what is going on here? You know, at the time there were 5 of us, like when I initially joined, right? And everyone sitting in that room knew everything there was to know about Reddit infrastructure. So I would never have to go far to ask like, hey, what is going on here? You know, we wouldn't have the time to solve it correctly, but everyone was there. Now it's a much larger organization. And so you have a lot more cross-functional and you have a lot more siloing, and you have situations where it's like, I have no idea why this thing would be breaking. I haven't seen this done this way. Hey, what does your service actually do? Why are you calling us? That type of thing tends to come up. So there's more, I guess, I wouldn't call them fires, but definitely there's a lot more organizational work that has to be done in order to go about putting out the fires. You know, it's not just one plucky team of, it's not a fire brigade. It's more like, you know, you're managing a slew of fire departments across a metropolitan area.
Okay, so talk about your role. So you said you were technically a sysadmin, whatever you want to call yourself. Now your official role is principal engineer.
Yep.
How has your role evolved in terms of like what you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, when I definitely, when I joined, I expected to be mostly a systems focused person. That was where my expertise lied, right? But everyone wore all the hats at that time. And so I ended up having to do quite a bit of community stuff as well. So I wrote some blog posts. I got involved with some moderator discussions, whenever some interesting contentious issues on the moderator side. And that was not something that I expected to have to do, and I didn't have a lot of experience on, but I did develop like a reasonable amount of skill in actually interfacing with the community, and I found a lot of joy from that. It was sometimes very harrowing, and sometimes I would like have to escape back to my comfortable area of breaking systems rather than communities and people yelling at me on occasion. But it was an interesting challenge, and people kind of looked to me as a resource in that area. So that was a really, really unexpected situation. I think like kind of helped me grow as a person as well, because I was definitely at the time entirely focused only on the tech and never really considered the community aspects of things, of anything at that time. Learning about the community, I think helped me develop as a person. So I'm glad that I got that experience. Over the years, people got more specialized. We actually had community managers that we hired. We had a few contractors at the time that I had joined, but we eventually got a community team so that they could start taking care of these things. So my time spent on community stuff became less and less over time. And, I started evolving into a role moving from constantly trying to put out fires to like, okay, how do we actually get this infrastructure to a reasonable place, right? And gosh, I mean, I was so underwater at that time on the infrastructure that I remember thinking in 2013, I was like, hey, what should we grow the infrastructure team to? I was like, it'd be really cool if we had like 4 or 5 people. And that is just for what we actually needed. That's like a tiny, we were still so far underwater. It was so hard to tell how far the surface away it was, right? In terms of what the infrastructure actually needed to make it really streamlined, especially given all those years of tech debt that had piled up. So I still spent a decent amount of time firefighting, but I was trying to think like, how do we get out of this? How do we actually start like doing some forward-looking thinking about the infrastructure at Reddit? So I actually stepped away from the company for a couple of years in 2015 and 2017. I was over at Stack Overflow, and then I came back 2017. It had grown by quite a bit. Also, a lot of changes happened at that time. Steve came back. So he, one of the founders of Reddit, he rejoined as CEO and started doing more things on the investment side of things and growing the company and actually trying to like ramp up and we had a sizable office, which was a bizarre thing to think about in my first tenure at Reddit. And so I came back on the infrastructure side, did very little on the community side of things, was entirely focused on, okay, what do we do about this infrastructure? I spent a fair amount of time on the storage side of things when I returned, making the Postgres side scalable, making Cassandra stable, and I kind of ended up executing a lot of pretty sizable migrations and getting a decent amount of experience on that. And then in more recent years, as I've evolved more towards the principal title, it's been, the amount of time that I put into getting my hands dirty, just that proportion has gone down. The amount of time I put in firefighting, that proportion has gone down. And now it's really about like, okay, I'm aware I have a good understanding of most of this infrastructure. How do we get it to a place where it just like moves like a well-oiled machine? And that's what I really want to see. That's like what really drives me. I want to see this thing run like a well-oiled machine, but we still have a lot of that like legacy that exists that has to be tackled. And I have a lot of understanding of that legacy system. And so I have a unique amount of leverage on being able to describe that legacy system and help come up with ideas and help assist others on ideas on how to pick that thing apart and actually, make the system run well.
Would you say that is the main reason you're still at Reddit, that you still want to work at Reddit?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that there's like so many interesting problems that need to be solved at scale. That I think, to be honest, if you look at other our peer organizations, like other companies that are around our size, I would expect that their infrastructures are a little bit more mature than ours, to be very frank. And I think that is owed to a lot of that early history where we were really constrained on resources and are actually to do things. And so we had so many years of just trying to duct tape, and we built up this gigantic ball of duct tape, right? And now we have an organization that has sufficient size to start peeling that duct tape apart. and we have to really rework things fundamentally while also at scale. We're doing it now that we're really quite sizable. It might have been easier if we had a bunch of resources earlier, and we could have prevented that duct tape ball from getting so large. But now you have this kind of unique opportunity where, hey, you can't just replace this entire thing without considering the migration path of this huge amount of data. And I mean, there are very fundamental aspects of the infrastructure that have expectations that don't work at scale, right? That we have kind of made to work at scale, but they have long outlived their effectiveness. And so finding ways to take those fundamental expectations and rework them, I think is a very fascinating, unique challenge. And that's what drives me. That's what keeps me here. I want to rework those systems and get this thing to a point where, it feels well-oiled, and failures are going to happen. Failures are always going to be part of every infrastructure, but they should be well controlled, well understood, limit those type of cascading failures, and then try to eliminate as much of the legacy system as we can.
I think the promise of microservices is that it decouples things, makes them more error resistant.
Right.
I've usually found it to be just more difficult to work with those types of infrastructures, and that the issues, like the bugs, to be more difficult to discover. Do you think that in this process of taking the monolith apart and changing things, do you think the kind of microservice setup has helped actually do the decoupling, or has it made it more kind of tricky?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a reasonable amount of debate going on out there among systems folks, monolith versus services-based architectures. There's a lot of, it's like Emacs types Vim type arguments sometimes that crop up from that. So I definitely think we started moving to a services-based architecture before we were ready, right? And the drive at the time was okay, we need to bring in a bunch of people to go about picking this thing apart. But if all of those people are all working in one code base, it's going to become insane, which I completely agree with. It would be insane if you had a ton of people all working in one code base, all trying to deploy that one code base at the same time. Especially considering that was a legacy code base that wasn't designed for the scale, or designed with it wasn't compartmentalized in such a way that people could work on individual components without interrupting a lot of other components, right? So there was very good reasons for us to start moving to services-based architecture, but we didn't think more carefully enough about the type of contracts we would need to fulfill when doing that, and the type of failure modes that would pop up. So we just kind of started splitting things out, that there was no well-defined contract on that thing that split out how it was talking to the monolith and how it was talking to other services. And hey, if there's a failure here, how do we actually handle that? Who's responsible for the graceful handling? Okay, well, we would like to add some circuit breaking here, such that if this thing falls over, it doesn't cause this thing to fall over. Or oh, well, that circuit breaker now caused this other thing to fail in a unique way. And I say, hindsight is 20/20, and I say now, hey, we didn't have sufficient contracts. We should have thought about that before we dove into that. But I mean, at the time, I don't know if we have that experience now. I don't know if without that experience, we'd really have that appreciation of how much we depended in the system upon implicit contracts. And how much we really need to move to more a situation where there is much more explicit contracts between the services, and much stronger expectations, and much more well-defined methods for failover. So I think that services-based architecture is probably appropriate for our organization. I think our implementation that we have today needs quite a bit of work, and a lot of that is in regards to those agreements between those services, and making sure that that's actually written down somewhere, and that someone cares about ensuring that is implemented and maintained.
Let's talk about lessons that we could pull out of a big chunk of your experience at Reddit. Yeah. Do you have any suggestions for people that are trying to tackle tech debt, whether it's in a project or in an organization? Yeah,
for sure. One of the interesting things that happened at Reddit is that, everyone agreed that, oh, we don't like the legacy monolith. We would like to get out of it. Let's do these services-based things. Let's start picking this thing apart, right? Everyone was kind of on that page. But what happened is that if you are a development team and you need to get something done, you have two options. Your first option is we take that chunk out of the monolith, we split it off into another service, we execute a migration, we do a bunch of planning. Maybe 6 months later from now, we'll be able to do the thing we want. Or option two is, we'll bite the bullet and we'll just do it in the monolith. And option two is almost always the path of least resistance. Even though everyone has an agreement that they want to get out of the monolith ends up being the thing that you go into just because it is the path of least resistance from a technical perspective and from a timeline perspective. Something that I'd been pushing for a number of years is that we have to introduce intentional friction on doing things in the monolith such that it stops getting new code in it. Because as timelines demand, people are always going to keep adding things to it. And if people keep doing that, then we're never going to get out of it. And then everyone is going to be unhappy. No one likes this situation. It's almost like a tragedy of the commons type situation, right? No one likes it, but we have to actually put some friction in here to prevent it. So something that was actually implemented this year is the CTO basically put his stamp down and said, if you are going to do things in the legacy monolith, you have to get my stamp of approval on it first. It was intentional organizational friction to adding things to that old system because of the recognition that the timeline realities would discourage that type of thing. So now, if you are considering putting something in the monolith, you have to now consider, well, I need to make this argument with a straight face to the CTO on why this thing needs to go in this legacy monolith system. And I think that has greatly slowed down the amount of new stuff that is going into the monolith, which has sped up our ability to start picking it apart and start really actually making some progress on that technical debt so that we can address it. Another thing that I would really suggest is, I think, a technical debt problem tends to be one that you will encounter when you have new engineers that are joining and they look at the old system and they see all this mountain of stuff behind them and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start on that system. And when they come across things, I think they will have try to see it and they're like, oh, this thing must be here for a reason. It must be in this shape for a reason. I would strongly encourage to not, that's something that I try to tell engineers and to teach engineers that are joining is do not think that this thing was done with good intent. Because when it was built, it was probably built under duress. And the reason it was built may not even exist anymore. Hey, you have this control over here. I don't quite understand it, but I'm going to try and re-implement it when I'm refactoring. It's well, if you don't understand it and you can't find a reason why it's there, maybe we can actually just get rid of it. And that can scare some people, especially if you're a junior engineer, because I think it's a reasonable assumption that you may see things that you're not going to understand, right? But what I encourage people to do is hey, if you look at a thing and you don't understand why it is there, either try and figure it out yourself or try and find someone that you can ask that might have an understanding of why this is there, and make sure everyone is asking the question, is this thing actually reasonable to still exist? Is it actually providing some type of reasonable function for the system? Or does it just need to be refactored or completely removed? In a lot of cases, I think that there's plenty of things that just need to be completely removed. But it's hard to recognize that, I think, when you're a newer employee at a company with a fair amount of technical history.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to boil that down. Add intentional friction to the increase of tech debt. I love that. And don't always assume that something is there for a reason.
Right.
Ask around, make sure, find the backstory before you just say that's the best way we can do it.
Yeah, prosecute those problems.
Cool. Awesome. Okay. Next up, you mentioned that you do interviews a few a week. I'm curious, especially since you've probably been doing interviews for a while.
Right.
What are kind of maybe a couple of the things that you think that Reddit as a company is looking for in engineering candidates?
Yeah, for sure. So something that I look for, and the type of engineer that I tend to see be pretty successful at Reddit, is someone who is willing to look for problems that aren't necessarily in their normal scope and be willing to think about how to solve them. Right. If you join and you see this interesting thing over here, and you're like, hey, that looks a little weird. Does anyone know why that looks weird? The people that will dig into that further and then try to generate answers for it, I think tend to be pretty successful at the company. People that are are willing to, turn over the rug and look at like the dirt that has been piling up on the floor for so long and being willing to clean it out. Just kind of, I think, reasonably self-driven folks. I tend to see that those folks tend to be reasonably successful, and they also find a lot of reward from doing that, even if it's not necessarily like flashy, like flashy things. In our industry, there's this continual pressure to do things that are going to look flashy and that are going to like be resume makers and things like that, right? But there's plenty of stuff that exists that needs to be done that is kind of work behind the scenes. And while it may not be super flashy and snazzy from like a public perspective, if you can make a case for it and you can go about solving it, and by solving something, you can maybe not necessarily drive like a really crazy new feature, but save everyone an hour a week. Like the amount of leverage that you have added there is humongous. And then if you can also like, in terms of getting recognized for it, like document that and make it known that, hey, there's this problem that has been eating into everyone's time for forever, and it's this ridiculous thing, and I went in and found it and I solved it, and now that thing is just gone. And look how much time that we were able to get and how much leverage we were able to get. Like I really, really value people that are willing to do that type of thing. I really appreciate that. I enjoy doing that when I can myself. And it's not something that, it can be hard to make a case for that type of work sometimes. So approaching it almost in like a somewhat scientific type method of like looking at it, asking like what's happening here, getting a lot of data around it, and then recording the results, I think are important in order to make arguments for those type of things. For doing those things behind the scenes that are not going to be a user-facing feature, but are going to help the company in like some sizable portion, or maybe even a small portion. If you save everyone at the company 5 minutes a time a week, and it took you an hour to do that, you have more than paid off your hour, right? I really value people that are willing to tackle those type of things.
What are you excited about at Reddit right now?
Yeah. So Reddit is largely a single region architecture, and we would like to break that concept up. And I'm excited about this because it's going to force us to rethink a lot of those implicit contracts that I mentioned previously about the system as a whole. When you have had all of this implicit expectation of everything being in a single region, you lean upon that a lot, and those things are not well defined. Well, now it's like, well, what if we added, 50 or 70 or 200 milliseconds of latency between system A and system B? Well, now you need to have a really good explicit understanding of like what the expectation is between those services. So I really like the multi-region effort that we're working on, because it acts as a forcing function to help define those contracts. And I think it's also going to be a driver of like overall stability of the system. Right now, a lot of eggs are in one single basket. If we have multiple baskets, then we will lose less of our eggs when the bottom falls out. So those are pretty exciting initiatives that I'm very interested to see, like how we're going to go about solving these problems and how we're going to go about reworking these contracts.
With something like that, like moving to multi-region, the first thing that I go to is I think that it's like the heaviest in like the infrastructure department in terms of like routing between services and DNS and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But when you talk about adding latency to those connections, that kind of starts to be like a service concern or software concern.
Yeah, where I see most of the interesting problems that lie on this challenge is wherever you're storing your state and how you're interacting with your state. And a lot of our system has an expectation of completely consistent state because, hey, we have a lot of Postgres. Postgres has strong transactional guarantees. It is always in a state that you can anticipate, right? And there's practically zero replication lag in the system that we are using today. So you just don't have to worry about that type of thing. But when we start thinking about multi-region, we need to necessarily start thinking maybe about eventual consistency or maybe about query cancellation, such that you like understand that, hey, this is not a consistent state, we're going to retry it. So I think where it really comes in on the service teams is how those services are interacting with their state. Should that state live in multiple regions? Should it live in a single region? If so, can we get it to a state where it lives in multiple regions? Are you comfortable like, hey, if it is just in a single region, can we have graceful failure of that type of system? So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done for the service teams on what they are doing with their state and their data stores in particular.
I'm docking myself a point because I didn't ask this first.
Sure.
What's the problem that single region to multi-region is solving?
So there are a few different aspects of why we want to go multi-region. One, like I said, I really like that forcing function because it really does make us rethink a lot of these concepts. So that's kind of nice, but that's like, I guess you might call it a emergence property of the migration itself and not necessarily a reason for the migration. The availability, I think, is a big one. If the region that we are in right now went down, we would still like to be operating as a business. That is probably a pretty important goal for us. Reaching folks that are far away from our current region in a more timely manner, I think would be beneficial. Right now, if you are in a region that's far away from our main region, your latency is probably not that great. And we do things on the front end to try and paper over that in different ways, but it feels like, at least the user impression that I've seen is it feels a little bit jankier than what would it feel like if you were close to our main region. And so making that experience better for users that are far away, I think is a reasonable reason to do that.
Awesome. Okay. So let's go to some non-serious questions.
Sure.
So if you're on a deserted island and you only had access to one subreddit, all the subreddits, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
What subreddit would it be and why?
Yeah, I mean, my very pragmatic answer would be the survival subreddit, which I've not looked at too much, but like I really like on YouTube. There's this person, Primitive Technology, who goes out. He's out in the jungle and he's just going about solving interesting problems using no tools at all. Like, hey, building a shelter, things like that. And I feel like the survival subreddit would probably cover a reasonable number of those things, such that I have somewhat of a shelter and I don't die of starvation and or poisoning within the first week of being on the deserted island. But beyond survival means, I mean, gosh, if I was there by myself and I had the survival things taken care of, it would probably be something to occupy my mind and my time. I really like the Ask Historian subreddit. I find that fascinating. So I can spend a lot of hours in there reading through things and learning about things. So I would probably have that at near the top of my list. I really like the Change by View subreddit because it is something I haven't really seen elsewhere on the internet, where it is a place where people are trying to actively engage in a healthy dialogue when they disagree with one another, which happens almost nowhere else on the internet. And I feel like that would keep my mind reasonably occupied. And then maybe a chess subreddit or something. I can always play chess with myself if I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah, I had to check our survival just to make sure it was still a survival subreddit. Sometimes those things change.
Yeah, sometimes the names, the context gets changed occasionally.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. What's your favorite meme?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I have a good answer for this. I'm not connected with the memes as they are.
You're supposed to be the meme king.
Yeah, I don't really know. Like, there's an area of culture that I just have so little context on, and I feel like they've all like come and gone, and so they're all so.
That's true.
So transient.
You don't want to show your age with the meme you pick.
I mean, even if it's not even age. It's just I don't understand. I guess I feel like things that would normally be relevant to me, I don't have a lot of time, or I just don't get them in a lot of cases. So yeah, memes are a mystery to me.
How about are there any Alaskan memes? Because I don't know anything about Alaska.
Yeah,
if there's some culture. It's an Alaskan meme.
In the Alaska subreddit, there is the meme that no one should move here, and that we have mosquitoes as giant as hawks, and that it's dangerous, and that there are bears everywhere. And that type of thing to try and keep people away. Because it's like, I think the general population is like, that's tourism drives a lot here. So economically, it makes a lot of sense. But tourists bother the locals in a lot of cases, so they try to keep them away. So like, there's always questions in that subreddit like, hey, I should move to Alaska. What should I do? And the answers are generally please don't move to Alaska.
Yeah, we have tarantulas and death scorpions. Yeah,
yep, for sure.
Sounds good. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for chatting with me for a while, Jason.
Of course.
I appreciate all your answers.
Yeah, of course.
See you later.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you, Ryan.
So what do you think? Does it sound cool to build Reddit, one of the largest sites on the internet? If so, check out our open positions at www.redditinc.com/careers. And to get more behind the scenes info, check out Reddit's engineering blog at reddit.com/r/redditeng. And that's it for now. See you in the next episode of Building Reddit. Building Reddit is an official podcast from Reddit. This episode was produced by Ryan H. Lewis. Thanks for listening.